Welcome to Out to Lunch Festival. I'm Alan Maben, and you're all very welcome, whether this is your first event or one of a number of events that you have enjoyed. Out to Lunch is a cultural oasis designed to wipe away the January blues, even in a period of pandemic. Check out the website cqaf.com for the programme, which runs until the 30th of January. And if you search YouTube for Cathedral Quarter Arts Festival, you'll find a playlist allowing you to catch up with most of the shows you've missed. This afternoon, we're delighted to be able to turn to the subject of Frederick Douglass and bringing to life this character and the enduring issues he was tackling. We're in the very capable hands of Dr. Aidan McQuade. He's an expert on slavery and forced labour. Maybe I should say he's an expert in researching that area and kind of lobbying in that area, particularly in Myanmar and Bangladesh. He's the former chief executive of the Anti-Slavery International, and he's the author of the book The Undiscovered Country. So as he speaks, if questions occur to you, pop them in the Zoom chat. If you're watching on YouTube, hop onto Zoom and pop them in the Zoom chat, and we'll try and pick up as many of them as possible after his talk. But now, put your hands together and wave them silently in front of your cameras and give a big out to lunch welcome to Aidan McQuade.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm sure you have better things that you could be doing this afternoon. Like watching the news, but really appreciate it. I want to talk about three things today. First of all, who was Frederick Douglass? Secondly, why is he important in grand historical scheme of things? And third, why is he important to Ireland? And in particular, now that there's to be a statue of him in the city centre, to Belfast and to the north. So starting off with who Frederick Douglass was. He was born a slave in Maryland, probably in 1818. His mother was a slave called Harriet Bailey. His father was almost certainly white. The rape of black women by white men was an intrinsic part of the American slave system. Douglass wrote later that he never recollected ever seeing his mother by the light of day. Such were the long hours that she had to work. He wrote in his autobiography how he was separated from her at an early age. This was customary treatment for slave children in his part of Maryland in those days. Now, as we've seen in recent years, indeed as recently as last week, there are many Irish women alive today, north and south, who from bitter personal experience at the hands of our own indigenous systems of slavery in the mother and baby homes and in the Magdalen laundries, know the depth of the anguish that Harriet Bailey must have felt at the forcible removal of her child. After this separation, because she only lived about 12 miles from Frederick, Harriet managed to see her son a few more times before her death when he was 7 years old. Thousands of Irish women never even got that consolation. And like the thousands of children born to these Irish mothers, Frederick was haunted for the rest of his life by the loss of his mother through the brutal separation of slavery. Now, after being separated from his mother, he lived first with his maternal grandparents until he was about 6, when he was removed again to work for a family called the Olds. When he was about 12, Sophia, the wife of his master, Hugh Old, did something that all of the slaveholding South would come to regret in later years. She taught Frederick to read. Hugh, her husband, profoundly disapproved of this, telling his wife, quite correctly, that education was incompatible with slavery. Eventually, Sophia came to agree with her husband and stopped teaching Frederick and tried to prevent him from reading. But by that stage, it was too late. Frederick continued to educate himself by reading everything he could lay his hands on, having realized, as he put it later, that knowledge is a pathway from slavery to freedom. Douglass eventually managed to escape in 1838 with the help of Anna Murray, a free black woman he fell in love with. On reaching the north, they married. The couple settled first in Massachusetts in the whaling town of New Bedford. Eventually, they would move to Rochester in New York and finally to Washington, D.C. But it was in Massachusetts that Frederick began his career as an anti-slavery activist and writer. He impressed the growing anti-slavery movement with his account of the brutality of his slavery experiences and the drama of his escape, as well as with his public speaking skills. In time, he would become one of the most famous orators of the 19th century, traveling tens of thousands of miles in support of anti-slavery and other progressive causes. His first volume of autobiography, published in 1845, was not only a powerful indictment of slavery, it also helped shatter the racist myth of the intellectual inferiority of Black people. Having escaped slavery, Frederick marked his freedom by changing his surname from his mother's Bailey to Douglas, taking the name from the Walter Scott poem, The Lady of the Lake. This was in effect his adoption of a nom de guerre. As his profile as an anti-slavery orator grew across the North, this brought growing risks to him as he became a target for slave hunters from the South, keen to return such a high-profile escaped slave back into the hands of the old family. So it was decided that it would be a good idea to send him on a speaking tour of Britain and Ireland, both to raise the profile of the issue of American slavery and to move him beyond the reach of Southern slave hunters. He arrived in Britain in 1845, and in the next 2 years, as the famine gripped in Ireland, he travelled Britain and Ireland to obtain support for the anti-slavery cause. He delivered his first speech in Belfast in the Independent Chapel in Donegal Street, and that's where they're talking about putting a statue now. In Dublin, he met Daniel O'Connell, and he spoke at large meetings in Cork, Waterford, and Limerick. Many of those towns have already commemorated those events. His sojourn in Britain and Ireland directly led to his personal emancipation. Anti-slavery activists in these islands raised the money needed to purchase his freedom from the Owls. This enabled him to return to the US to continue his anti-slavery work free from the attention of the slave hunters. Now, the risks of slave hunters were very real in the 1850s, even in places like Massachusetts. The federal government, in so-called compromises to try and diffuse the tensions between the states, turned many of the instruments of federal power to the service of the slaveholders in the South. For example, it was made illegal for Northerners, even in free states, to assist runaway slaves. In some notorious cases, US Marshals actually assisted the return of escaped slaves to the South. This didn't deter Douglass and others, most spectacularly perhaps Harriet Tubman, from continuing to assist others to escape, often into Canada on the Underground Railroad. Douglass's biographer, the American historian David Blight, notes how Douglass's powers as an orator grew while in Britain and Ireland. So too did his thinking. And perhaps influenced by the continuing collaboration between the federal government and the slaveholders through the 1850s, he evolved from someone who espoused the end of slavery through moral suasion and other peaceful means into someone who became a vocal advocate for a hard war against the South to break the power of slavery once and for all. In this, he was, at least initially, a minority voice, but as it transpired, a prophetic one. When in 1859, Douglass's friend John Brown tried to provoke insurrection against slavery, he was regarded as a dangerous extremist. But things began to change the following year with the election to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln, in spite of his personal experiences of child labor and child slavery, had said that he only intended the modest ambition of wishing to stop the westward expansion of chattel slavery. But his election provoked secession. And soon after this, Brown's sometimes brutal violence began to seem less extreme and instead ill-timed. A secession in the South was a reaction of those states who were upset that the gerrymander that they had built into the American Constitution in 1789 to preserve the slave power was finally overwhelmed. It was simply insufficient to cope. The balance of voting power that had been granted in the Constitution was simply insufficient any longer to cope with the shifting demographics of the United States and the growth of a population of voters in the North and West who resented the value of their labor being undercut by the enslavement of millions of human beings in the South. So when the Confederacy fired its first shots in the cause of their racism at Fort Sumner, the hard war that Douglass had long had longed for finally arrived. The development of the rifled musket, with its increased range and the accuracy with which it could deliver dreadful wounds, meant that few, even many of the generals involved in the fighting, could conceive of just how hard and bloody that war would become. Douglas was too old to fight in the Civil War, but his sons fought. And indeed, if any of you have ever watched the film Glory, excuse me, Morgan Freeman's character in the film is part based on one of Frederick Douglass's sons, Lewis. And Douglas continued during this time to travel across the North, recruiting black troops for the Union Army and continuing to write and campaign and speak on behalf of slavery abolition and in favor of civil rights. So why is Frederick Douglass still important? Frederick Douglass's contemporary Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the greatest figure of the 19th century and one of the most endlessly fascinating, not least because of his enduring qualities of genius, humor, and humanity. But we should never forget that the Lincoln who was elected in 1860 was as casually racist as many of his white contemporaries. He thought initially that blacks and whites probably could not live together in the same country, and he supported the removal of free blacks from the United States to new colonies such as Liberia and West Africa. That Lincoln changed so fundamentally over the course of his presidency was in considerable part because of the influence of black leaders like Frederick Douglass, and perhaps most decisively because of the example of the ordinary black soldiers of the Union Army. As the war wore on, there was considerable pressure on Lincoln, particularly on the eve of the 1864 presidential election, which had looked like he was going to lose. There was considerable pressure on him to make peace with the South and to allow slavery to be preserved. This Lincoln resisted. While he may sometimes have been slow to move on the issue of abolition because of his diverse concerns regarding public opinion and military strategy, often limited the scope of his action, but when he did move, he was always decisive. The promise of emancipation being made, he said, must be kept. I should be damned in time and in eternity if I ever betrayed that promise to the black troops who have fought so bravely for the Union. Lincoln's life ended with that potent mix of triumph and disaster, with the war won, the Union saved, and American chattel slavery consigned to the dustbin of history, just as an assassin's bullet struck him down. He can sometimes be depicted as the last casualty of the Civil War, but there were other casualties after him. And the triumph of slavery abolition itself received grievous setbacks in the decades after his death. Institutionalized violence against black communities continues right up to the present, and the election of Donald Trump shows that racism still has a potent allure for millions of people in the United States and beyond. So if we focus too closely on Lincoln as the emblematic American life of the 19th century, we lose perspective on some enduring truths of American history and society, and of the struggle for civil rights in the United States, and by extension to the rest of the world. In contrast, the life of Douglass demonstrates the importance of protest and struggle in the effort to obtain and sustain progressive gains in society. David Blight uses the term Second Republic to describe the period after the Second American Revolution of the Civil War, when the United States was fundamentally refounded by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. These abolished slavery and established the principles of equality before the law, at least for most people. But even with the Union triumphant and these hard-won gains in that Second American Revolution, those achievements proved precarious. As anyone familiar with violence will know, prejudice and hatred can survive, particularly perhaps even in an environment as hostile as that of the hard war that Grant and Sherman brought to the South at Abraham Lincoln's behest. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, was an unreconstructed racist who stood idly by as the Ku Klux Klan launched their bloody campaign of terrorism against unarmed civilians across the South. Johnson's successor, President Grant, was much more aggressive in his assault on the Klan and in efforts towards establishing universal civil rights. But as his administration became embroiled in corruption scandals, Congress was lost to pro-Confederate racists, and the counter-revolutionary Jim Crow era was born. This established systems of discrimination, segregation, and economic exploitation of blacks in systems akin to the contemporary form of slavery known as debt bondage. Most dreadfully, the lynchings of black people for crimes more often imagined than real became routine in the South of the 1890s. The disinterest of the federal government in ensuring equality before the law by this point meant that there was little need for the South's racists to hide behind Klan hoods as they murdered defenseless black people. The establishment across the South of monuments to Confederate leaders, many of them also Klan terrorists, was a further public means by which white supremacists told their black fellow citizens to know their place. Now, immediately after the Civil War, the old anti-slavery movement for a while lost direction, unsure of its purpose following the gains of emancipation. But Douglass understood that it was necessary to fight to preserve those gains. This he continued to do until his death. After that, the mantle was taken up by new generations of civil rights leaders, from Booker T. Washington and Ada Wells, to Martin King, Rosa Parks, and Thurgood Marshall, to today, Conor Kaepernick, and I would suggest also Michelle Obama. But even the election to the US presidency of a black man who expanded access to healthcare for millions irrespective of the color of their skin has not dulled the nostalgia of over 70 million Americans for white supremacy. And we see this in its personification by that glutinous and ignorant oaf who makes no secret of his contempt, not just for the lives of black people and vulnerable minorities, but also for the well-being of the fascist foot soldiers who support him. But the election of Joe Biden gives the United States an opportunity to renew the fight against racist hatred. So there is cause for cautious optimism there. Optimism is more difficult in Britain and Ireland at the moment. Brexit, a deeply xenophobic and often racist project, has already struck at the foundations of our peace process in Ireland. Soon its other economic and political effects will bite, increasing consumer costs, destroying jobs and businesses, and stealing the rights of young people to live, study, work, and love across our common European homeland. Soon this may be followed with the threatened bonfire of labour and environmental rights that many in the current British government seem so keen on. In spite of what some amateur revolutionaries may dream, no workers' utopia ever springs forth upon the scorched earth that such destruction leaves. Instead, rights lost have to be regained by renewed efforts and the spilling of much ink and sweat, usually tragically in the shadow of the destruction of lives and livelihoods. But Frederick Douglass's life reminds us that we are not the first people to face bleak prospects. In the 1850s, as the power of the slaveholders in the United States seemed to surge, Douglass and his comrades faced a much more desperately bleak prospect. But through this time, and in the bleak years after the Civil War too, Douglass personified what his biographer David Blight calls a duty to hope. Douglass recognized that no one in the black community had the luxury of despair, because that would paralyze action. Instead, in those dark days, he and his comrades continued to write and speak, to organize and lobby politicians, to risk their lives and liberty assisting slaves to escape, to seek pragmatic expression of their idealism. Slowly but inexorably, they turned the tide of their history and they began to overcome that entrenched system of violence that sought to deny their very humanity. Ireland today, north and south, is thankfully a much more multicultural country than it was when I was growing up. Our traditions now are not just orange and green, but Chinese, Indian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, and Polish as well, among other vital and vibrant European, African, and Asian communities. To echo the words of Desmond Tutu, we are also becoming a rainbow nation and will be all the better for it. Our public art should reflect this. So a statue of Frederick Douglass in the centre of Belfast says that it is a city that values inclusion, diversity, and the struggles for universal human rights. Just as a statue of John Mitchell in the centre of my hometown, Newry, says we are a community that knows little about our past and is prepared to overlook this repellent person's repellent racism. But Douglass is also important to Ireland and Belfast in other ways. Belfast did not have a fleet of slave ships involved in the genocidal transatlantic slave trade. As historian Philip Orr has recounted, a 1786 venture to establish such a fleet was thwarted by the reformist citizens of the city. As Orr writes, the proposal to create a slaving company in the town outraged Presbyterian ladies like Martha McTeer and Marianne McCracken, who formed the Belfast Women's Anti-Slavery League. Slavery also outraged members of the volunteer movement in Belfast, who had been influential in gaining greater independence for Ireland within the empire, and who, in this dynamic northern town, often expressed egalitarian and revolutionary views. They organised Bastille Day celebrations on the streets of the town in the early 1790s and raised a large flag as part of the procession on which had been painted the picture of a chained slave. It was followed by another banner which asked, "Can the slave trade, though morally wrong, be politically right?" Business people from Belfast and other parts of Ireland certainly profited through other forms of trade with slavery. But it still should be a mark of pride for Belfast that the trafficking in human beings was not permitted to become as foundational to the city's growth and prosperity as it was for Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow. And even as the city's radicalism waned in the 19th century, Marianne McCracken was still, at the age of 88, to be seen in Belfast docks, handing out anti-slavery leaflets to those boarding ships to the United States. Surely that's another subject ripe for a piece of public art. Now, one of the people that Douglass wanted to most meet when he was in Ireland was Daniel O'Connell. O'Connell's reputation as an anti-slavery campaigner had already stretched across the Atlantic. He at one point said that of all men living, an American citizen who is the owner of slaves is the most despicable, and insisted that his movement should accept no money from American slaveholders. At one point, the US ambassador to London challenged O'Connell to a duel for referring to him as a slave breeder. But having already killed a man in one such senseless encounter, O'Connell avoided a rematch. O'Connell understood that human rights are a universal thing. This is something that Douglass, in spite of his lacuna about the plight of Native Americans, is something that he also understood. As he put it, we must enter into the troubles of others, because as such troubles affect other human beings, they must also be concerned to all of us. It was an attitude that led Douglass to be an advocate for votes for women and on behalf of the starving Irish. It also led O'Connell to speak out on behalf of Australian Aborigines and the Maori people, as well as in the cause of anti-slavery. This attitude of the universalness of human rights is relevant still, because too often, when concerned with our own troubles, we lose sight of the fact that there are millions of others like us around the world struggling against similar domestic and transnational cliques of privilege for the same dignity, the same freedom that we dream of for ourselves. Now, neither O'Connell nor Douglass were flawless human beings, but then none of us are. And you don't have to be a saint to be a hero, even just for one day. Both men left the world better than they found it by demanding that it become so. Both showed, as thousands of men and women before and since have shown, that words matter. They showed that the force of an argument, such as those Douglass put to Lincoln, can change minds and bring people together, organized around new ideas and new understandings. It's easy to say there's no use arguing, but that tends to be said by those who refuse to recognize that often arguing is what has changed the world. The struggle against slavery at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century showed this. It was a time in Ireland when Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter were united in common cause, not in some trivial issue, but in something of world importance. Too often, perhaps, we get caught up in our own local quarrels and feuds. But what we see in the Irish anti-slavery struggle of the past is a capacity to move beyond that sometimes. That capacity lives within our society still and emerges from time to time in response to injustices such as war and famine overseas and poverty and pandemics at home. As we have seen over past years, the scourge of racism still blights the United States and much of the rest of the world, including Ireland, in spite of Imelda May's powerful assertion that you don't get to be racist in Irish. Some buffoons still disgrace our nation with such prejudices and intolerance. The scourge of slavery also still affects an estimated 40 million people across the world to this day in forced labour and forced marriage. In South Asia, millions of Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, are enslaved to work in agriculture, in brick kilns, and in sanitation, manually cleaning up the waste, including the shit, of the more powerful in their society. One young man described his experiences. I studied commerce and banking, but I couldn't find work. Even though I'm educated, the village council would only hire me to clean toilets because I am from the untouchable community. There's been no respite from the COVID pandemic for such sanitation workers. As another Dalit sanitation worker said about his work during the plague, at least social distancing is nothing new for us. The rest of society shuns us already. Just as colour was the basis of enslavement in the Americas in Frederick Douglass's day, caste is the basis of enslavement in contemporary South Asia. And just as in Frederick Douglass's day, cotton and clothing is particularly tainted with contemporary slavery, today, recent years have seen concern about forced labour in the Uzbek and Tajik cotton crops, which supply a huge percentage of the global demand for cotton. More recently still, there have been very credible reports of the enslavement of Uyghurs in Chinese cotton production. The use of slavery-like practices are not confined to the cotton fields. Many of the factories of South and Southeast Asia employ young women and girls in intensely exploitative conditions, sometimes amounting to slavery. Indeed, slavery so pervades the garment sector that it is probable that each of us on this call who is wearing cotton is wearing at least one garment that bears the taint of slavery still. But contemporary slavery is not confined to the global South. More than once over the past few years, I've worked with lawyers in the north of Ireland who have been desperately endeavouring to ensure that their clients are not re-victimised by state authorities who seem intent on imprisoning them for cannabis cultivation by overlooking the indicators that they have been trafficked into this labour under threat and violence. The year before last, I worked with the International Transport Workers Federation in support of their campaign to end the system of tied visas that made trafficked forced labour such a commonplace in the Irish fishing fleet, north and south. Contemporary forms of racism and slavery such as these are in every country of the earth, and just as in Frederick Douglass's day, they are the products of political systems and political choices. The choices to underfund education, for example, particularly for girls. The choices to tolerate and sometimes encourage racism. The choice to victimize the powerless, and the choice to privilege the greed of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. If that makes you angry, it should. Frederick Douglass was also an angry man. He was righteously angry to the day he died, indicting his own nation for the systematic failures and the systematic violence that it brought to its people. That violence of slavery, that violence of racism, and that violence of lynching. It's important to remember this anger when we think about him and the patrician images we see of that most photographed American of the 19th century. To make the world less outrageous, you must first be outraged. Indeed, outraged enough to make yourself unpopular with those making the decisions to maintain the systems of exploitation across the world and to maintain the systems of neglect and exclusion at home. Douglass took his anger and controlled and shaped it through the power of words and argument, And that in turn helped shape not just the politics of his age, but also of the future. Perhaps few of us have the stature to influence policy that Douglass had then, and maybe that Marcus Rashford has today. Many of us do not have the harsh life experiences of Douglass or Rashford to fully empathize with the injustices of which they speak. But we can still understand, and we can still act. And as Bobby Kennedy reminded us, the history of our times is shaped by numberless diverse acts of courage and belief. And it is these that ultimately twist the moral arc of history towards justice. Our duty to hope means that we must never forget that.
Thank you very much, Aidan, for that. A blast through history, but also through what's kind of going on today. I have a couple of questions before I kind of pick up some of the stuff that's kind of coming in the chat. So do encourage people to kind of raise your questions there. I may even invite you to come on screen and kind of pose your question. Very dangerous from a chair to allow other people to appear. But I think it'd be nice, given that we're on Zoom, for some of you to kind of do that. Talk to us a bit about statues, Aidan, because I suppose I have two questions. One, I suppose one is you kind of say that kind of saints and heroes, we don't have really, nobody is fully perfect, and we see a lot in our current affairs of we had Bristol in terms of pulling statues down, but is it a dangerous thing to put a statue up for someone, because it nearly forces people to look into their past and look around for things that are more disappointing than the things that we're celebrating?
Well, Abraham Lincoln wasn't a saint. Frederick Douglass wasn't a saint. I would still say that they're probably deserving of their statues, given that the positiveness of what they did was much greater than the negativeness of their lives. We then have other more problematic people. I was speaking to, I don't want to speak out of turn on his behalf, but John Mitchell's biographer a while ago, who and I hope I'm not serving him injustice in this. And he wrote a very, very fine biography of Mitchell, and he said the more he was writing about it, the more he found he didn't have very much positive to say about Mitchell. So I think context is very important. I know the City Council in Newry is thinking about what they can do with this statue of Mitchell that would maybe provide greater context about it. I'd say, wheel it off into a museum where you can properly contextualize that rather than having it as a piece of public art. But I think the thing about things like public art is that it should reflect the community, and it should enable inclusivity of the community. So as Ireland becomes more multicultural, I think it's important that Ireland North and South becomes more multicultural. It needs to become important that it has public art which welcomes people from different traditions, which recognizes and reflects the contribution that they make. This isn't a relatively new idea. One of the best pieces of public art, I think, in the world is the memorial to the Massachusetts 54th Regiment in Boston, on Boston Common. And that was originally meant to be just a memorial for the colonel of the regiment, but his family insisted that it should also recognize the troops, because if he had not had the troops to fight alongside, he would have just have been a man in a silly hat and a horse. And that then becomes something which becomes a much more inclusive piece of art, showing that the centrality of the Black experience during the American Civil War as well. People have been overlooking the fundamental racism of John Mitchell for decades, and worse than that, have been excusing it. And I think that whenever you look at just how central that was to his thinking, it becomes much more problematic having that statue there. But going back then to the American statues of Confederate generals, these were such a political statement. These were about making people know their place, and the fact that they were putting up statues to people who were essentially traitors to their own country because their treason had been in behalf of white supremacy, is a very, very, very pointed lesson to make. So I think one has to be quite careful in terms of the nature of the art, and make sure it's an inclusive thing, but also have space that it can be reinterpreted and understood in different generations.
As time goes on. And in terms of Belfast picking Frederick Douglass for a statue, I mean, does that say something? I wouldn't want to say it's a tenuous link to Belfast, because it's not, but does it say something that we, in order to be able to recognize something in that area in terms of anti-slavery, in terms of fighting for those rights, that we have to go nearly quite far outside our own kind of cohort in order to do that? Do we learn something a bit about? I mean, I'm going to maybe get John McCann to ask a question in a wee second, but does it tell us something about Belfast and Northern Ireland, or Ireland back then, that actually we, that this is how we need to market?
I think actually what it does is it reminds us that Belfast was an international city then, and it was somewhere where clearly Douglas and the anti-slavery movement thought it was important to come, and it's somewhere which did indeed have its own very vibrant and powerful anti-slavery movement within it. Now it's a pity that that's been forgotten. I think if Statue of Frederick Douglass begins to remind us of that as well, that's a good thing. And I mean, Isaac Nelson, who was a Presbyterian, I think, minister in the Shankill Road, he also was a very powerful anti-slavery activist during the middle of the 19th century. Interestingly, he was also a Home Rule MP for a period. And as far as I understand, there was a bust commissioned of him, which now sits in a corner of the Orange Hall on the Shankill Road. I'm not sure whether they're aware that he was a nationalist MP as well, but it's sort of something which is being pushed off into the corner, that we forget just what some of these people represented. Whenever Obama visited Ireland, one of the places he wanted to go was to the grave of O'Connell. And I think a lot of people were wondering, well, why do you want to do that? And it's because he was such a significant anti-slavery figure in the 19th century as well. So I think it's good if we can have some reminders to ourselves that in the past we have looked outwards, and we have looked outwards in order to fight for justice. And we still do that whenever you look at, for example, some of the support which Irish and Northern Irish folk have given to famine relief and disaster relief over the years. We still do that, but it seemed to be almost has become a subculture rather than the rationale of a lot of us, which was much more back then. I get the impression there was much more back then.
I'm going to ask John McCann, who's I think he's kind of beaming in from probably Dundee, but is probably well known in the theatre spaces in Belfast. I mean, John, you have a question there. You ask away in terms of about the economic benefit to cities like Belfast and Dundee, and the context and the nuance around slavery and what we've benefited from. But off you go.
Yeah, well, I mean, Frederick Douglass visited Dundee many times as well. We have existing letters which he sent to various people back home who were helping him on his trip, reminiscing. But yeah, one of the things I'd like to ask is, and you touched on it briefly, Aidan, and in your talk, and thank you very much for that. It was an excellent talk. Was the notion that, and I've often, when I worked in Belfast, I often heard people talking about, no slave ships ever came here, nothing ever dropped anchor in the, on the Lagan. And I'm kind of cautious that cities don't allow that fact to absolve them completely of their responsibilities that ancestors had. I mean, Dundee did not have slave ships, but it, like Belfast, was a great engine of empire, and it did benefit greatly from the slave trade. The jute that was brought to Dundee was brought in ships that were owned by the East India Company directly from Calcutta into Dundee, manufactured jute, and those ships, that trade kept on going. But when the jute was processed and manufactured, it was shipped from Dundee directly to ports in America. Whenever North America abolished slavery, Dundee continued to send its ships to the slaveholding South. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about the economic benefit that Belfast obtained from slavery in other ways?
I mean, Philip Orr has written and talked about this as well, in terms of, while there wasn't a slave fleet in Belfast, there was things also like, I'm not sure if jute, but certainly shoes, certainly the trade of sugar and coffee and rum, all benefited Belfast and all benefited Irish society as a whole. There was Irish people involved in slavery in the Caribbean. Then you had people like John Mitchell and co. being vocal advocates of the Confederacy and believers of the return to the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, so the point is not that Ireland and Belfast wasn't implicated in the slave trade, but at least there was protest, and very effective protest from time to time, in that, you know, a city like Belfast, in spite of the efforts to establish a slave fleet, never got one, is not an insignificant achievement for, I think, Belfast to be proud of. And that was reflective of the wider anti-slavery community. And certainly, if you're moving then into the 19th century, while there was strong anti-slavery sentiment in particular parts of Ireland, particularly in the Protestant community, it must be said, there was also great acquiescence towards slavery in other parts of the community. You know, the real, I suppose, and you know, subsequently, you know, Irish soldiers not only fought for the Union in the Union Army, but also participated very energetically in the genocide of the Native Americans in the decades after the Civil War. Also, probably Belfast and Ireland's greatest contribution to slavery was the discovery of what's it called, the vulcanization of rubber. And that led to enormous demand for natural rubber from the Belgian Congo, which led to a new slave trade, a new genocide right across that part of Central Africa as well. So I think the broader lesson is not that we were morally pure, but that at least that we were certainly implicated in the slave trade and slavery, and still are right up until this day. But some people chose to fight and sort of lifted their eyes beyond their local struggles, their local concerns, and to think, well, what sort of a world are we trying to make for everybody else? And I think that's something which we should be proud of, and which we should do more to emulate.
John, you have a very quick follow-up, and then I'm going to go to Deborah.
Okay, thanks. Ian, can you speak briefly about the resistance to slavery in Belfast and such, but the resistance that Douglas faced when he was on his trip in Ireland and Britain, from grassroots who were basically protesting his presence from what he stood for?
That's probably not something I can speak that much about. I know that one of the things but that suddenly makes sense of something. I'll tell you what it is. One of the things that he said, was particularly pleased about traveling through Britain and Ireland, was the lack of prejudice that he felt. And so he wasn't getting stuffed into third-class rail cars whenever he got onto a train, for which he bought a first-class ticket maybe. But that certainly wasn't a universal feeling. There was prejudice, certainly right through Ireland and Britain at the time. And interestingly, in later years, particularly after the Civil War, whenever he was talking about granting of suffrage to the Black community, he used to make a regular joke about the drunken Irish being allowed to allowed to vote. So why shouldn't an educated and sober black man be allowed to vote? So he does seem to have picked up, in spite of his friendship with O'Connell, does seem to have picked up a bit of anti-Irish prejudice whenever he was in Ireland. So that might suggest also that he also then encountered some anti-black prejudice when he was in Ireland too. I think there was also maybe an element that he was pretty anti-Catholic in certainly in later life, being very much a product of the northeast of the United States. So he seemed to have much greater affinity for Scotland than for Ireland. So that may be some of the reason for that, but that's not something I can recollect, speak too much more about.
Deborah, I'll bring you in at this stage because there are other abolitionists, if you like, locally as well. So maybe talk a wee bit about Mary Ann McCracken and how we celebrate her.
Okay, Aidan, thank you very much for your lovely session. It was so heartfelt and thoughtful, and there's plenty to think about here. What I particularly liked was your mention about context and statues and how we bring art to the public space in that way, because it isn't historical, it goes on. You mentioned Mary Ann McCracken, and I think a few of us here are wondering, I know Bill Wilson mentioned a mural, but are we going to put up a statue for Mary Ann McCracken? Because she is somebody who did speak to power. And that is really that's what you're talking about as well. It's speaking to power. These aren't historical monuments. And some of the most objectionable statues are the ones that were put up as a way of intimidating people and of speaking power down to people. So what are your thoughts? And like, she was there, like you said, right to the end. Even though slave ships didn't land, she was giving out anti-slavery leaflets. And that says a lot about her bravery and her strength. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I fully agree with you. I think, I mean, if you're gonna, it just seems to me the image of Mary Ann McCracken at 88 years of age handing out anti-slavery leaflets to immigrants going to the United States, saying, "Don't be involved in that sort of thing." It just, I mean, I'm not an artist, but I think even I could probably come up with a brilliant sculpture reflecting that, and that's before, you know, you give that to a proper artist and you could come up with something really quite spectacular. I think it would be nice for a whole variety of reasons. I think it recognizes the historic indigenous anti-slavery struggle. It recognizes the role of women within this. It recognizes all of those things, and I think it could, you know, in the waterfront into the docks in Belfast are looking increasingly nice. So why don't you put a bit more art into them, particularly of somebody like Mary Ann McCracken?
I'm going to, sorry, I'm kind of wrangling the Zoom and asking questions at the same time. I'm going to take a quick look down through some of the other questions and just kind of maybe pull out some of the comments and things here. Aidan, you might want to kind of interrupt me and comment as we go. We've got some stuff here in terms of blah, 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 blah. I think Mary Ann McCracken gets a few mentions. Robert McMillan, he kind of says, if you're interested in the relationship between Ireland and USA and so on, there's a group worth following, the African American Irish Diaspora Network. They're on Facebook, and there's a website, aaidnet.org. You can follow them there. Also, Marsala 005 says, you know, feel like I've been angry all my life, and loves the saying, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. That's kind of, I mean, that's nearly a motto unwritten for a lot of these folk who were kind of taking, I mean, they were doing the sharp end of lobbying. They were very unpopular for what they were saying. They took great personal risk, but it was an anger and in a sense of injustice. It wasn't just noticing injustice, it was actually their blood boiling and doing something about it, wasn't it?
It was the story about Thomas Clarkson, who was an English abolitionist in the 19th century, who, when a student at Cambridge, had entered a essay writing competition and the subject was on slavery. And he sort of approached the essay, just, you know, win a few bob, and he approached it and quite agnostic to the issue. And then as he was writing, he came sort of thinking to himself, this is really fundamentally wrong. And the story was then he was traveling up to London one day, and he got off his horse for a rest, and he sat down under a tree and thought about it. Well, if it's wrong, it should be stopped. If it needs to be stopped, somebody needs to stop it. And there's nobody else about, I suppose I'd better do it. And you know, in the end, and in the beginning, you had this very small group, mostly Quakers, plus Clarkson, who was Church of England, and Granville Sharp, who was Church of England, who formed this core. And around that, then they just started agitating and campaigning and risking their lives. You know, Clarkson was gathering evidence in the slave ports of Liverpool and Bristol, and there was attempts of his life all the way through. There was attempts in the life of all sorts of people. I mean, there's been probably going to be attempts in the life of Joe Biden and co as well. You know, you stick your head above the parapet, certainly there's going to be risks. But again, that's how the world changes. It changes whenever enough people say, we're not putting up with this anymore.
You mentioned Quakers and some of the churches there. Is there a religious bent to Douglas's kind of backstory as well, or in a sense it doesn't have to be, because it's not a, and often church was on the wrong side of lots of moral and ethical things.
He was certainly, he was a deeply religious man, and it's
Right.
certainly echoed all the way through his speaking. David Blight writes about the huge. Obviously, one of the things he learned to read from was the King James Bible, and there's this echo of King James language all the way through his speeches. And very often he would touch back on the key stories from Isaiah and others and Exodus in order to draw analogies. It was part of the cultural fabric of the time to which everybody could relate, and so this was something he could talk about, and knew there'd be a cultural resonance with that. What is it? Blight compares him to Jeremiah and the use of the Jeremiad in terms of the way he spoke. So he was certainly a very religious man all through his life, very much of this reformist Presbyterian sort of Methodist type of Protestant faith, which kept him going all the way through his life. Yeah.
Are you just you mentioned, not by name, but you definitely talked about Trump in your talk there. Are you disappointed that they're kind of, that those characters aren't kind of sometimes standing up and making a real impact in the media these days? It's not about handing out leaflets; it's usually about kind of taking your making your stand on the airwaves. Are you disappointed that when it comes to some of those kind of big cultural issues that need to be sorted, that are the American South is not, I mean, we shouldn't characterize it as being the kind of cesspit of it, because it's wider than that in America and actually in our own country. But are you disappointed that there aren't those kind of Douglas characters who are getting higher volume in the media?
I mean, I think we've all been impressed by Marcus Rashford this year. He's speaking on quite a narrow issue, which he knows personally, but an exceptionally important one. I think there's other folk have been sticking their heads up, often celebrities. Gary Lineker's never been one to keep his gob shut, which you gotta love him for, given that so few others are doing that. What's his name? A comedian on Dancing on Ice the other night actually made a point about child poverty in the UK. There's a few folk. I mean, it can get hammered down very quickly, particularly if you're saying something which is uncomfortable to somebody powerful. And I think there's always that effort to actually, how do you get your voice heard? In Frederick Douglass's time, public meetings, public speaking were part of the great public entertainment of the day. So he had a medium in which he could then communicate his message. That's much less so now. So it tends to be people who are, good at Twitter, good in the TV, will tend to get heard more. There is some folk, but there's an awful lot who are doing it, but there's an awful lot of people who are keeping their mouths shut. And the contrast to that is then if you get colourful people on the other side, people like, neo-fascists like Farage, and we have a few in Ireland as well, they also get picked up on because, people will watch this, it'll be entertaining. So it's almost a double-edged sword there, but I'm not sure what's the best way to get the alternative agenda forward, the progressive agenda, the agenda of toleration forward. I think if all of us try to keep pushing the idea then there is some hope for that. There's a line Seamus Heaney had, which was, "The voice of sanity has grown hoarse." And it will grow hoarse as we try and speak truth to power, but I think we still must persevere with that.
Mm-hmm. We're kind of coming towards a close here. I spotted something there from Fanula, who reminds us that Mary Ann McCracken, there is a bust in Belfast City Hall. Actually, if you walk around the corridor in days when pandemic allows us to go back into the building, I mean, there are, if you walk around those kind of public corridors and even upstairs, there's a lot of kind of material that actually is kind of secreted away there, and you only really see if you're in the tour. Well worth a look around, and the free tour is pretty good, I think, in terms of kind of seeing some of that. I suppose a couple of things just to finish. If people want to find out more about Frederick Douglass, where do they go other than track you down and make you do more lectures? And what are some of the good sources?
I'm available for weddings and
funerals, bar mitzvahs.
The Bible on the subject now is this one, which is David Blythe's biography of Frederick Douglass, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year, I think. It's superb. And you know, if that's a bit too heavy for now, I'd say rewatch Glory. That's always something which the movie Glory, always something which bears rewatching, I think. But David Blythe would be the key book to go to in terms of outstanding, elegantly written, and gripping account of the man's life.
Okay, and if people want to get more involved in actually fighting slavery in terms of discovering more about what's happening in the world on their own shores or further afield, what are good places to actually kind of connect with that and get involved?
I mean, getting informed, there's two organizations of which I still do work with. One's the Dalit Solidarity Network, and the other is the International Dalit Solidarity Network, which do a lot in relation to the questions of slavery and discrimination and racism against the Dalit community in South Asia, and that's a key one. So I think one of the places to start is you can get informed about that. Anti-Slavery International, which I used to be chief executive of, also has good research, does good research in the issues of slavery across the world, as you'd hope. The Guardian has a good anti-slavery section within it as part of its broader global development section. And Thomson Reuters Foundation News also does very good coverage of the issues of contemporary slavery around the world today. So those would be good places to get started. Mm-hmm. All those NGOs need financial support as well. And as you get informed, be prepared, if nothing else, to ask questions of public representatives and business leaders as well in terms of, do you know about this? What are you doing about this? Every business in the UK is meant to produce a modern slavery statement. Most of them are rubbish. Most of the statements are rubbish, and don't well deal with the issues of forced labour in the supply chain. So there should be increasing pressure on businesses to deal with the issues of forced labour in supply chains. And the European Union is working on a due diligence law, human rights due diligence law. So that should bring that requirement much more widely across the European Union once that's passed, hopefully next year or this year. So there's a number of things you can do. If you don't feel you can do a lot, still do the little bit you can, whether it's a tweet or a letter to the local newspaper or a letter to your local MLA or MP. Do that. And the more people are doing that, the more chance there is that something will be done.
Okay, I think we'll probably draw it to a close at that point. But can I thank you very much? Can I also thank Meena Varma for reminding me that you're a mastermind champion, and you when I checked the bio with you, you didn't add that in, so that was very gracious of you to hide that light under a bushel. But I think can we kind of put our hands together, however we can do that on Zoom, to thank Aidan for his talk, and
thanks everybody for coming.
Check out, there's lots of other stuff happening in Out to Lunch Festival. Keeps on going until the end of January. If you want to hear this again, look on YouTube later on this afternoon under Cathedral Quarter Arts Festival. It'll be there, or check out the website cqaf.com. And with that, Aidan, many thanks, and all the best.
Thanks very much.